Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. My name is John LeBaron. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer here at Pattern. We're excited to bring to you an amazing webinar today on tackling the EU, the world's most complex e-commerce market. And today we are joined by European experts today. Charlie Bennis is the principal consultant in the international team here at Pattern, and Chris Vincent, whom you may have seen in the past as well. He's our Chief International Officer here at Pattern. So we welcome both of you guys and thank you so much for joining today. As a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to registrants and attendee following. I do encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature here on the webinar to be able to ask questions of the panelists. I will be moderating the session and I will try to get to some of those questions as appropriate. We'll also have time at the end to leave questions to Q&A. But like I said, I definitely recommend you guys put some of those questions up there, and I'll ask the moderator or I'll ask the panelists as we go through here. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. Wanted to give a quick overview of Pattern before we dive specifically into the European markets. As you may be aware, Pattern is one of the largest third-party sellers in the world. We are a tech company, we are an agency, and we are an international kind of behemoth here. We just opened up our 18th office here, and we have offices and distribution centers all over the world. We help brands attain profitable growth and control on e-commerce platforms and marketplaces around the world. We do D2C, we do subscription, we do a ton of marketplace. We're one of Amazon's largest sellers, one of their top 5 sellers in the world, the largest in health and personal care. We represent brands, over 70 brands, across pets and consumer electronics and like I said, health and personal care, tools, a lot of different categories. And we honestly just love working with our brands and helping them expand their footprint across the world. So high level, some of the brands that we work with here, obviously the Pattern International team does a lot of work on consulting, retail consulting, e-commerce consulting, go-to-market consulting with a number of different brands, as you can see here. So very excited to be able to answer any questions that you may have and lead into the world of Europe marketplaces. So at a high level, I think some of you may have seen the slide before. This is a 2-part series, the second of a 2-part series. The first one we did was on tackling China. And as we did in that webinar, wanted to walk through a little bit of the gross market value, GMV, by region in billions of US dollars. So as you can see over here on the left-hand side in the Americas, you have some decently sized, GMV across marketplaces like Walmart.com, Amazon.com, certainly a lot of the D2C space here. So over in Europe, just a quick level snapshot of some of the countries, and we'll go through in just a second some of the big marketplaces here in Europe, but just wanted to provide this snapshot to give you an idea of, especially as brands, want to go international and especially into Europe, we'll get a lot of questions around which market should I enter first, which are most lucrative, which are most attractive across the different markets. So I guess before I go into here, or too much further here, wanted to kind of provide an overview of what this market looks like. And really, when we say market, it's just an easy way to kind of classify this. The crazy thing about Europe in particular is it's this amalgamation. It's not like different states of the United States, right? They're entirely different languages, entirely different cultural sets, currencies, languages, all that sort of stuff. And so to call it a market, Europe a market, is fundamentally flawed. And I think that's what we'll go into. But for the sake of simplicity, I think on this webinar, when we talk about the European market, really starting to look at who are the players, especially from a marketplace perspective. So Amazon clearly leading the pack. They just made an announcement recently on opening another marketplace. And so we'll get into that in a little bit, but high level, any comments here, Chris, on, you talk to brands that you're based out of Europe, obviously. You talk to brands every day that are going and trying to tackle these marketplaces. Do you feel like people have a decent understanding of the size? Any, I guess, misconceptions or preconceived notions that, this slide would help kind of alleviate or tackle?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. I think, when we start to, amalgamate all these slides together, when you look at Amazon and eBay specifically, AliExpress, I think you could probably put into this bucket as well. But each of the different Amazons are different sizes. When you start putting them all together, then they start rivaling the size of some of the, the very biggest markets globally. And for Amazon, that's absolutely the US. I think the trick is, to take advantage of the market sizing that we have here is, we currently have 6 different instances of Amazon over in Europe, and being able to play on all of them, or understanding which ones you should play on versus the ones that you shouldn't, I think is key to success in the market. And likewise, if you're playing on eBay or AliExpress or some of the smaller markets, and of course, the same rules apply. When we look at these 6 different marketplaces here, this is just a selection of, a number of marketplaces across the region. And of course, we're trying to give you guys a view on the most common ones, but a lot of the questions that we get is, where should we go? How should we work on it? And while we start talking a lot about Amazon and some of the bigger marketplaces, of course, we work on many, many different marketplaces globally. And I think, what we do as part of our consultative approach to this is we look at your brand and your business, and we help you figure out where you should go in quite a complex market, as we've titled this.
Love it. So maybe Chris, I'll just stay with you for a second. You can help us walk through, kind of the state of the European markets. One of the things when I was talking earlier around the complexity of geography, of distance, of language, of culture, of, economics and things like that. Maybe you could speak a little bit to the decentralization in some countries of even just general economies, and how that affects things like distribution and infrastructure as well. But I'll let you take it away as you go through here.
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking about the percentage of shoppers here. That, I guess the stat is the percentage of shoppers that shop on marketplaces, or their propensity to do so. I mean, if you look at France, Germany, China, Australia, they're all around that, mid 80s mark. If you look at the UK, it's slightly lower. Now, I think to set the stage here, this is pre-COVID numbers. So we've seen an acceleration, I'm sure, in all Western markets where, Amazon and marketplaces have become more important. In some places, they become, the only channel where you can get some products. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in the UK. So I see that number at 68 for the UK growing quite a bit. But I think, the key thing to understand for any US delegates that we have on at the moment is that Amazon specifically doesn't have the kind of power in Europe that it does in the US. There's a lot of rules that, Amazon enforce in the US market that they just can't enforce in Europe. And therefore, it makes it easier for us to work in this ecosystem over here, or brands to work in the ecosystem over here, than sometimes it is over in the US. But interestingly, if we look at opportunities, and I think we'll go into a bit more detail in the individual markets in a bit, but it's quite interesting with the UK being a lower percentage. We can see a lot of shift going there. And of course, Germany and the UK are the 2 biggest players in Europe from an Amazon perspective, with France coming third. Yeah, but I think we'll talk a little bit more about the detail underneath the hood, and some of the things that we've seen across the different markets in a couple of slides later. So, I mean, John's touched on some of these differences already, but, when you think about the complexity of Amazon over here, a lot of brands just say, well, we want to go to Europe. Well, okay, well, that's great. But, do you have any awareness in German? Do you know what it means to set your listings up in French or Spanish or Italian? It really, becomes complex quite quickly. So what we do is we take a look at where the awareness is already. We help you figure out what markets you should go in, what ASINs or what SKUs you should take to those markets. But the things that you should be thinking about is the number of languages that you need to translate into. So Amazon currently sells in 6 different languages right now. We know that they're opening up Sweden in the next sort of 2 months. The strong rumor is early September. I don't know if that will be delayed because of any further activity with COVID in Europe, which seems to be heating up a little bit. And then in the new year, we're told that Poland is going to launch. And this is kind of in line with the strategy that Amazon has, where they're marching east into Eastern Europe, higher population counts there, underserviced markets. So we know that this is only going to get, more complex as we go forward. We're selling in 2 different currencies now, which is pound sterling and euros. I think we need to be aware that, you know, this is going to get more complex as we go forward with Brexit, because there's going to be a customs union put in between those two different markets. We've got what's called pan-European FBA, which means you can ship to all the markets, but the UK has just been removed out of that. I think the other major point to call out here is that there is no such thing as MAP outside of North America. That's a majority of a US and Canadian thing. When you start going outside of the Americas, you can't really talk about price. Retail price maintenance is illegal. So we have something over here and in most other markets called selective distribution, which I won't go into a huge amount of detail today, but it is essentially a policy that you can set up to make sure that you can choose or select who distributes your products. And this is a way to get around it. Again, you can't set a policy to say about a certain price, but you can set criteria around qualitative and quantitative actions that you can take. So the seller has to have a minimum store rating or a minimum number of reviews, these kind of things that you can put up. There's different rules by market around products. There's different duties and taxes that are in play with the different markets. And importantly, I know there's a big to-do about Amazon switching their delivery and moving to a more one-day delivery model in the US, but this is pretty standard in Europe and the UK. There's some pretty strong delivery capabilities. Of course, it's a smaller geographical space, so it's easier, and the number of warehouses that Amazon has makes this feasible. But delivery is really important, and that whole FBA promise over here is even more compelling than it might be stateside.
So, man, so many things to cover on here. I mean, I guess one of the questions I have is just, is there something that tends to be one of the biggest obstacles as you look at all of these? Obviously, there are a lot of different things you'd have to look through, and a lot of ways you could kind of mess stuff up. Any things that are particularly, you know, you kind of see, I guess, as a landmine that people usually step in if they're not either in Europe or they're not as familiar, like a mistake that they often make?
Yeah, so there's a couple, John. I mean, I think the first one would be customs and duties, just making sure that you understand that. Cross-border sellers, you know, can sometimes get around these because they're doing individual personal sales. So sometimes those aren't subject to customs and import taxes. So that's something to be aware of. Pricing is another one. So a lot of brands that we work with usually only have pricing in local currency or have a very small price book. So they may not be able to price in euros, or they might not have the ability to work in pound sterling. So I think just making sure that you understand what the right price is in the market when you go in, and this is something that we've helped brands with for years. And I think the last thing is just making sure you understand the seller landscape. So who's selling competitive product to you? What's the price points? We've had a lot of brands come in and say, we want to sell product A in Europe, for example, and then, you know, Chinese sellers are everywhere, but there's also local sellers that might have an established market in place. And even though you might be $1 billion brand in another market, when you come to Europe, it's about the awareness that you have in that market, which doesn't mean you can't launch. It's just about being realistic about marketing dollars and what those success factors are going to look like for you when you come in. But I think those are probably the three most common for new brands. And for existing brands coming in, the most common issue is very much this idea around the lack of MAP, or, you know, the idea that you can't set retail price. And so, you know, selective distribution is a real thing. Brands are doing it right now that we work with, and doing it very effectively. Once you get to that policy and put that policy in place, it's very similar to a MAP enforcement. We work very closely with Voorhees out of the US, and they have partners over here called Euclid. And so it's the same game, really. Once you get that policy in place, that hard enforcement is the cease and desist, we will sue letters. And once you get to that point, I think probably relevant to know is the Europeans tend to be a little bit more compliant around the rules. There's a lot less litigation that happens in Europe versus where, you know, what we've experienced in the US around, you know, arbitrage or sellers that shouldn't be selling your product. And so hopefully that will give you a bit of comfort, but it is a little bit different than setting up a MAP policy because, you know, there is no standard terms that you go in there. This is very much what works for your brand when you're setting it up. And again, these are all things that we work with brands on when we're bringing them over to Europe, or when we're helping them tackle a European problem that they may already have.
Excellent. Well, I want to get over to Charlie to have him walk through some of the other marketplaces in the region. But Chris, one final question. I know a lot of, it's, I guess maybe on this list, it might fall under the distribution policy. I know a fair amount of brands that I chat with that have some level of presence in Europe already do get frustrated because of kind of gray market activity, either sourcing products in Europe, pushing them over to the US, or even Amazon doing it, right? Amazon playing their own arbitrage game across their own marketplaces and borders and shifting inventory from UK down to France or what have you. Do you want to speak a little bit of that and how prevalent how often do you run into that and what kind of are some common strategies to mitigate some of that stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's super common, right? Imagine if we had 6 Amazons in the US and they were competing in different states with each other. You'd imagine sellers would be, dropping in all over the place to try and, gain some kind of competitive advantage state to state. And to some extent, that is kind of what happens over here, although the seller landscape is less complex or less evolved than it is in the US. I mean, some of the techniques you can do is, you can require local, and it is important to have local languages on the packaging, on the content. Now, some of the brands that we work with have EU compliant labeling. So that means it covers all the major languages and can be sold anywhere. And I think when you do that, that's really where you get back to that selected distribution policy. You need to make sure that they are authorized to sell the product in that market. And there's different things that you can set up in order to ensure that that doesn't happen, between the different jurisdictions within the 28 member states of the EU. What the good thing about setting up something with selective distribution is as soon as you set that up, basically, if the brand or if the seller is not present and doesn't have a business set up in the EU and is not actually present in the EU, you can immediately turn that gray market or cross-border stuff coming out of other markets into the EU. So essentially what you're doing by setting up the selected distribution is you're setting up basically an embargo area around the EU and within the 28 member states of the EU. And then it becomes an internal problem that you can deal with within the selected distribution criteria. Without selected distribution, people from China, the US, Middle East, wherever the product's coming from, can drop into the market. And it's very hard to track these people down, as you know. I think the other interesting thing, the important thing to note about sellers in the EU is by law over here, we have to have a legitimate company backed up behind a store. So in the US, I think there's a lot of fronts and lack of information about who the company is, who's actually selling the product. It makes it very hard to police them. I believe there's been a recent ruling where the Amazon is forcing people to now put legitimate, businesses down so they can be tracked down. But in the EU, we already have this. So it's very easy to tell who's selling your product and where they are. It's by law, and you can't set up an account unless you have that information. So it is easy to track down the sellers over here, and it makes the compliance side much, much easier.
Yeah. All right. Awesome insights here. And I think everything we're reviewing just underscores the title of this webinar is definitely if China is the most lucrative, EU is definitely the most complex. So let's keep going along here. Charlie, this is your first time on one of our webinars. I'd love a quick introduction to some of the folks attending, and then let's get into some of these other non-Amazon marketplaces here.
Yeah, thanks, John. Sure. I'm Charlie Bennis. I work really closely with Chris on the Pattern International team based out of London. So my role really revolves around 3 core pillars, which are the commercial aspects of doing international and European deals in specific. Then the marketing technology that we have here at Pattern. I work on a lot of the internationalization and the localization of our marketing technology here too. And again, also devising marketing strategy for brands that are looking to come into Europe. I've done a lot of my previous life before Pattern were doing kind of big multi-channel strategy pieces for brands such as Nike, where they'd be looking to launch into new markets across a number of different channels. So that's kind of where my expertise comes in there. But more recently, like I say, I've been looking at kind of the commercial aspects of launching onto all of these different marketplaces at the moment with a particular focus on Amazon. So if we take a look at this slide here, and this kind of adds to exactly where we were at with Chris on a few slides back, not only is there complexities around launching into Europe from pricing and language, tax and duty side, there's also a number of different marketplaces that you can launch onto depending on your product category, depending on kind of the niche that you sit in. For example, bol.com is, I think, about 50% of online consumers in Holland have purchased on bol.com in the last year. So it's a really big marketplace for them. Amazon have just launched into the Netherlands, so I'm sure there'll be a huge amount of competition for that kind of marketplace, well, market-leading marketplace in the Netherlands. But nonetheless, there's still a big force within the Netherlands. If you look at eBay as well, so eBay has a presence across Europe. I think there are up to 16 different instances of eBay. In the UK, for example, it's the second biggest marketplace. In Germany, it's also pretty big, and also in Spain and France. With eBay, there's also been quite a preconception that it's been second-hand goods that have been sold on eBay. But looking at the stats, actually around 80% of listings on eBay are for new products. So there's a real shift in kind of how people are viewing eBay, and a lot of brands can now sell on there with a lot of confidence that they're not going to be undercut by second-hand goods. If we look down the list a bit further, Zalando.com is a huge marketplace in Europe. It's based out of Germany. It's mainly focused on apparel, fashion, and beauty. In those categories, it's probably outranking Amazon in Germany. However, total marketplace sales, it still comes into a close second place. Now, Zalando has instances, again, across Europe, and has a similar platform or distribution platform to Amazon, whereby you can put it into ZFA, which is their fulfillment option. So you can ship your goods into Zalando, and they can help fulfill those around Europe. Much like with the UK Amazon situation, that's also going to be devolved because of the Brexit, because of the UK leaving the EU. And then we've got Real and Otto.de. These are two other German marketplaces. These cater for all different categories, but they also have kind of a high propensity, particularly Real.de has a slightly more female user base or consumer base, and they have a lot of home and house products on those websites. So that just hopefully gives you a bit of an overview of kind of the different marketplaces that you can access within Europe. Interestingly as well, just to add, they all have slightly different barriers to entry. So for example, bol.com, you need to make an application, as well as Otto.de. You can't automatically just start selling and set up a seller account. Otto also require proof that you've been selling in market with a revenue stream. So they don't often accept sellers just with no kind of previous experience of selling within Europe. Obviously coming through Pattern to do that is quite a nice route in.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Charlie, for walking through those. You know, I know we have a ton of slides to cover, so I'm going to push up, you know, our cadence here a little bit, but, you know, maybe you can speak to a handful of these, and we will send the slides out after for people to review. So maybe you can just touch on a handful of these, Chris, and in the sake of efficiency, as we go through a handful of these countries, and you just give us the lay of the land.
Yeah, for sure, John. I think there's three things that we're looking at here on each of the next three slides, which cover France, Germany, and the UK. Purchasing consumer goods online, annual consumer goods sale, and probably the most important one is the average annual revenue per online consumer. So how much they're spending and the particular growth rate. So if we look at France here, probably the interesting number to look at on this slide is, 1,039 USD. If we go to the next slide, John, I can just contrast that with Germany, which is 1,251. Similar growth rates, in terms of online and annual consumer goods. Bigger population, obviously, in Germany, and probably a higher income per capita. That's important. Germany's a fairly wealthy member state in the EU, and some call it the engine room of the European economy. We go on to the next one is the UK, which has, almost double the German slide. So you're looking at 2,062 in terms of sales. Really interesting here. And I think one of the things that we'll probably go on to in the next couple of slides is talking about, why that is. There's a lot of, because it's English speaking, a lot of brands tend to start up there. There's a high propensity for, online shopping in the UK, not necessarily for online marketplace buying, as we saw earlier. Again, a relatively high population in a small geographic area, it lends itself really well to online selling. I think the final point in all this is just to keep in mind, everyone, that all these slides are, pre-COVID, and we expect these to really boom. So in terms of, the growth rate in terms of online buying and the annual, revenue per online consumer, I think if we were to do this same stat and look at, 2020 as a whole, I think the number would be way higher than what we're showing here for all the markets covered.
Yeah, I think really good point. So, Chris, I want to get back over to Charlie to kind of walk through some of the Amazon specific opportunities in Europe. Anything else you would add before we kind of get into that?
Yeah, well, so I think when we cover off the next couple of slides, there's some interesting stats to look at with each of the countries. Just, a couple important things to remember. We've seen just an absolute boom in what we consider to be smaller markets here in Europe around Italy and Spain, especially over the last 3 or 4 months. I think we've got some stats in later around the growth that we've been able to achieve with some of our brands, but really interesting that, more traditional markets that weren't really online savvy consumers have very, very fastly shifted towards the online space. So we're seeing tremendous growth in those markets. And of course, Amazon has coped fairly well with the growth, but this is something that's super interesting and why a lot of brands are coming to us in Europe now, because it just is accelerating so quickly. So with that, I'll probably pass it over to Charlie.
Excellent. And maybe I'll just interject real quick before I move to the next slide. Just as a quick reminder, we're about halfway through the webinar at this point. If you have additional questions for the panelists that you want answered, feel free to type them into the Q&A section. The other thing that I'll just kind of remind for a handful of people that may have joined after I kind of walked through a little bit of this earlier. So Pattern is a third-party seller. We operate on these marketplaces. We buy inventory, oftentimes at wholesale or some version of wholesale. We take care of the fulfillment, the distribution. We're highly turnkey. We take care of the advertising, the SEO, the product selection, the imagery, all that sort of stuff, the customer service, that selective distribution piece that Chris walked through earlier. So everything that we present is basically in context of that reality of where we stand and where we operate. So just wanted to make sure that that was clear for the people attending who had not been on one of our webinars before, of kind of where Pattern fits into the mix of this. So with that, Charlie, why don't you take it away and just kind of give us a quick overview, I guess, of comparison side to side along these Amazon marketplaces.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, John. Hopefully this slide can give you a really good view of actually how, when you look at Europe and aggregate each of the markets within Europe on Amazon, you can see that combined, they almost come up to the same kind of size as Amazon.com in the US, which offers a significant opportunity for any brand in the US looking to expand internationally. As Chris said on the previous slide, kind of Italy and Spain have typically been kind of some of the smaller markets, but post-COVID, we'd kind of expect that to change. We've seen significant growth in those markets recently with our brand. So I'd expect those numbers to be quite a lot higher if we revisited them at a later date. Also to add to this as well, and I think Chris mentioned earlier, but Amazon are going to launch Poland and Sweden in the near future. And while we don't have a firm date for that, Poland in particular has a big population, as a large country, so could add quite a significant amount of demand into the European Amazon kind of ecology. Another interesting takeaway from, oh, sorry, John, before you flip over, the other interesting piece to look at on this slide is the average visit duration and the page visits. So the consumer behavior when on Amazon is actually pretty similar to that in the US, despite quite a lot of cultural differences. And that can come down to a few things. In Germany, for example, we've often seen that consumers are a lot more diligent before they make a purchase. However, I think Amazon does give them that trust to allow them to go on and purchase. Obviously, the key caveat there would be that you want to get your content right, and localization is going to be a massive part of that. But if you can get it right, there's definitely a huge opportunity to be selling in all of these markets. And if you flip over to the next one, John.
Yeah, I would love to start walking through some of the categories here.
Yeah, I mean, this is another interesting piece, and I think when I first kind of viewed this data, it wasn't exactly how I thought it would lie out, but in the US, the top 6 categories pretty much align across Europe as well. There's a few regional nuances where certain categories excel in certain markets, but generally, if you're selling in one of these top 6 categories in the US, you can assume there's going to be a strong demand here in Europe as well. Largely, electronics and kind of home and kitchen are 2 of the biggest areas here in Europe, and they're where we're finding a lot of kind of success so far.
Just one point on there, John, that I might jump in on that I don't think we've touched on before. When we look at some of these markets and the categories that are in there, you know, one of the things that is different culturally that is probably worth calling out is just the propensity to return products. And culturally, like with some markets, for example, Germany, we know there's very high return rates because very similar to like a Zappos model, the German consumers might buy a number of the similar products in different sizes or different colorways. And they've grown up in online where you just buy a whole bunch of products and then you return what you don't like. So something just to be aware of when you move into the market, you may already be in there. You may be wondering why the return rates are higher for your market in Germany, or you're not aware. Just to watch out when you're looking at those. Not all categories are the same, but certainly, you know, fashion and apparel has a very high return rate in places like Germany.
Awesome takeaway. Chris, you obviously have a front row seat to so much of what's happening in Europe day to day. You're working so many deals and talking to so many customers. What are some key takeaways that you can share with everybody here?
Yeah, well, so I think we'd probably start off by talking a little bit about what's happened over the last few months. I think that would probably be quite relevant for, you know, people looking at Europe now or experiencing Europe. I mean, it has been a mixed bag in terms of, you know, the experience that brands have had with Amazon. I think Amazon generally has held up. They have announced some restrictions over here, very similar to the US. So what we're seeing is Amazon being more aligned with the policy that they put into the US around COVID. So a lot of brands are having restrictions on new ASINs being put in around 200 units. They're raising the inventory performance index, which is the IPI score here, if any of you are aware of that. And so that's more of a back end metric, but they've raised it from 350 to 400, and now it's going to be 500 by the end of August. That's September 1st. You're gonna need 500. What that means basically is you'll be restricted on the amount of stock that you can hold within Amazon if you don't meet that score. Amazon has generally won and been the big winner with this whole COVID-19 thing in Europe. The one exception is probably France, where they had a shutdown for about a month that was mandated by the government. I think it's more political than anything. The situation in France wasn't any worse than it was in any other markets. But the French have they're very, have some national pride, I guess is the way to put it. And so they're trying to up their own marketplaces like Cdiscount, for example, at the expense of Amazon. That doesn't mean that Amazon is not going to win there ultimately, but I think it's just something to be aware of that, you know, they have some headwinds against that market. You know, Prime Day is just not as big a thing in Europe as it is in the US. Of course, Prime Day has been pushed back in every market. And, you know, I guess the net effect of the Prime Day pushback for us is that it's going to extend the peak day trading period over here and may accelerate the discounting going into the holiday season. So something to watch for brands that are already in play in Europe. Prime subscription continues to add value to Prime users over here. So for any of you that are into your soccer, or as we call it over here, football, they've streamed a number of Premier League matches. They're talking about running that into Europe as well. And they've gained a lot of new subscribers off the back of that. This is part of the Amazon flywheel that they're using. And, I think the fulfillment offer is generally pretty good, top notch. There's a number of sellers taking advantage of that, but the landscape, as I mentioned earlier, is just not as robust as it is in the US. There's not a lot of FBA sellers compared to the average listing or the average number of resellers that you would see in the US. So both Prime sellers and the total number of sellers is less, but growing quite rapidly. And as you can imagine, with COVID-19, there's been a big focus on people launching their products on Amazon. And as a result, Amazon is putting these restrictions in place to make sure they can economize their space. But luckily, as one of the top sellers globally, we have a great relationship with Amazon, and we've been able to circumvent a lot of these restrictions just because of the pull that we have within the Amazon ecosystem. And of course, there's other marketplaces that, we've seen accelerate because of the same, factors that have made Amazon more successful in the last few months.
Excellent. As we move along, Chris, here, I've got about 20 minutes left, I think, here in the webinar. We want to talk about a little about growth, and let's do a little bit of a deep dive on what we're seeing on the marketing side as well.
Yeah, so this is just a bit of a view, a snapshot on the brands that we're working with here in Europe. It's an average score. As you can notice, there's a dip in the middle there with France. That's really down to the shutdown. We had almost no sales for the month of, I think it was April. And so, you know, we really, obviously, along with everyone else who is working in France, struggled a little bit there, but you can see the rest of the markets are pretty robust. You know, I think it talks to the power of the model and what we've been able to do. I don't think a lot of this is down to just COVID. You know, I think obviously the demand is up there, but a lot of the brands that we service and that we sell right now have nothing to do with essential services or, you know, we're big into vitamins and supplements as we are in the US, but some of our brands, you know, have nothing to do with that area. And it's purely down to, you know, trade performance as well as other external factors like COVID.
Excellent. What are you seeing on the marketing front?
So yeah, from a marketing side, I would say Europe is actually less mature than the US. Amazon's penetration in Europe is lower. There's still a huge amount of people on there, but if you take a look at some of the stats we've got here, the number of brands per keyword compared to the US is significantly lower, both across our sponsored products and our sponsored brands. Ads generally, and the rule of thumb is that reduces our average CPC and helps brands get a bit more bang for their buck when they start spending in Europe. Again, the key caveat here is you want to make sure that your content's absolutely spot on before you start sending ad traffic through to like listings pages in France, Germany, Spain, Italy, because otherwise you're just going to be wasting those ad dollars. The other key thing here as well, in Europe, there hasn't seemed to be any great technology that's come into play that manages to integrate with Amazon's ad platform. We're super lucky with Pattern. We've got an incredible development team that have created our Predict platform, which has got awesome machine learning and algorithmic tools that allow us to change bids kind of on the fly throughout the day, depending on performance. And I don't think there's another kind of player in the ecosystem here in Europe that can really match that at the moment. And we're just generating far more learnings and kind of advancing ourselves way more than I think anyone else in the space, particularly with a focus on the European market. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity in the marketing world, particularly if you're using kind of technology that's similar to ours.
Excellent. What's happening on the distribution front, Charlie?
Well, it's been mentioned a couple of times, but with Brexit, there's going to have to be kind of a localization of stock now. So as Chris mentioned, I think in the first few slides, pan-European FBA used to allow people to ship into one location in Europe and Amazon would do the rest. They could distribute the product around Europe into different DCs and then send it on to the end consumer. The real challenge now is that with Brexit, they're cutting the UK out of that. So brands are going to have to sell kind of localize where they put their stock. The benefit of kind of our position, is that we've already got both European and UK warehouses set up. What we're doing at the moment is working with brands to make sure we've got stock in both locations so that there's no kind of decrease or downtime in that transition from pan-Euro FBA, including the UK, to pan-Euro FBA, excluding it. And I think that's going to be a key thing for a lot of brands that have been relying on Amazon's pan-European platform. And I think that could cause headaches for them going forward.
Interesting. So Chris, there was a question that came up earlier around, you know, given, I guess, the success or the prevalence in the bigger markets like France and Spain and the UK and Germany versus the emerging, how do you balance what your distribution strategy should be? Where should you set up kind of European operations? Do you want to speak a little bit to, you know, Pattern's decision on where to put both offices and distribution facilities?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, my general advice to any brand that's looking to set up on the continent in Europe, I mean, the distribution hub that most people go for is, you know, in the Netherlands. There's a strip of land that's right beside the German border. That's where we have our warehouse, which is a place called Venlo. But that whole corridor there is heavy into distribution because it's a very centralized place. Germany is the biggest market in Europe. Amazon has a lot of warehouses on that border inside Germany. They're building warehouses in Poland. And again, it's like a half day's drive from Poland. But basically within a day, Amazon can reach a lot of its distribution across Europe within that corridor and that hub. So, my advice to any brand that's looking to set up would be, to put it in that general vicinity. A lot of big companies that we've worked with, already have their logistics function there. When you're looking at the UK specifically, the Midlands is a great place because they call it the Midlands because it's in the middle. So, it's easy to get to everywhere. Good transport hubs, good hubs for air and sea. So again, that's where we have our warehouse, lower cost of doing business up there compared to, having something near London, for example. But those would be the places where I'd put distribution. Again, if you have a very heavily skewed business towards Italy and Spain, and those are your big markets, then you may want to put something more in the southern reaches of Europe as opposed to places like Netherlands. But as a general rule of thumb, without knowing anyone's business, that would be my advice. John, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. There's another question around kind of the split of where sales are coming from, the big urban cities versus, outside. Maybe you can speak a little bit to, I know London, Paris, these big European kind of centers of economic activity. Maybe you can speak a little bit of the contrast that with how Germany operates.
Yeah, I mean, I think Germany is a very interesting market compared to the rest of Europe because a lot of the European countries have, maybe one or two major hubs within the market that has the majority of urban population. And of course, if you want to get a split on where Amazon is selling the majority of their products, you just need to look and see where they're putting their warehouses. But Germany is very much a more distributed market. There's 5 or 6 major cities. We're opening up an office in Munich in September. I think on the 21st, our country manager starts there. So he's ex-Amazon. But when we were looking at Germany, it's really difficult because in the UK, London's probably the best and most available place to put an office, which is where we are. When you look at France, you'd probably open up in Paris. If you're looking at Spain, it would either be Madrid or Barcelona. Italy, Rome. There might be a couple other markets or regions that we would look at. But in Germany, there's 5 or 6 different cities. And again, when you look at the profile of how many warehouses that, Germany has in Amazon, I think it's slightly different than what you would see in other European countries. But again, just keep in mind that one-day delivery, Amazon is prevalent in a lot of places because it has quite easy reach because these countries are geographically relatively small compared to, bigger markets like Australia, the US, where it's, got vast more space.
Interesting. So what's next, Chris? We've kind of gone through like the State of the Union on a lot of this stuff. What's next here? Look,
so I think COVID-19 is certainly not going away. I would like it to. I hope it will, but I think it's here for, at least the medium term. So we know that Amazon are thinking the same thing. They're further prioritizing, essential and what they call fast moving items. I think with COVID hitting the first time, a lot of people flooded their warehouses and now they're trying to get rid of some of that stuff because it's not selling. I think we can only see a doubling down of the online activity happening everywhere. Amazon is the leader, but we know that eBay have posted up some really big numbers across Europe. And so again, every single marketplace has had, boom time over the last 4 or 5 months. And that's only going to be set to continue. In markets like the UK, we've got major retailers. I don't, some of you may be familiar, but John Lewis, which is like, a Macy's equivalent over here, has talked about, these trends being permanent and they're shuttering some stores down here. So these are major department stores that are talking about, not reopening certain locations after COVID-19. And I think the experience in Europe, at least for the last couple of months, has been very different than what we've seen happen over in the US. So we've, relatively, and in a comparison point, had the virus somewhat under control over the last few months compared to what we're seeing in the US and some other markets, but yet still, the trend is continuing. So we see this being a long-term permanent shift in behavior. And I just think that some categories, and we've talked about this before in some other, some of the other presentations that we've done, that, you know, certain categories like beauty, where they're heavily represented in department stores, are already really looking for avenues to get online and partners to work with, because I can see the shelf space and the availability of this, you know, these product sets to be shown to consumers is shrinking in traditional channels.
So one of the questions that came through, Chris, is around, you know, what are some of the KPIs to drive sales through digital media? And I think that was maybe in context of the French market, but, you know, I know we're going to speak a little bit more to kind of some key benchmarks. So maybe we can go through that and see if that answers some of the questions, and maybe just have in your head, you know, this notion of if there's anything specific to, you know, the French market, maybe we speak to that too.
Yeah, sure. Well, so this is a study that we did, and I think you should be able to download it off of the Pattern site. If not, we'll definitely make it available. We've just rebranded into Pattern internationally recently, so we're just getting all the assets loaded up onto the Pattern site. But we did a benchmarking study of 100 brands across Europe, and so we looked at the different brands, and this is mostly UK and German instances of Amazon. So we're taking a look at the biggest impact across the market. So we're looking at the top 3 products for each brand, and then we chose products by searching for the brand term, and we look for localization elements. So this is kind of how we set up the benchmarking study. And the scoring criteria, again, I won't go into this in a huge amount of detail, but we had a number of criteria that we set up in order to benchmark the brands in the area. So stuff that you would think about. And when I think about the old days of direct to consumer, really it's the same kind of stuff, but applied to a different media, and so a different channel. So we're looking at product information, imagery, content, ratings and reviews, seller proposition and competition, SEO and keyword analysis. So all the kind of elements that we think about, you know, that I would say are good KPIs to look at when you're judging your own brand and your own listings on marketplaces, not just Amazon, but of course this particular report was focused on Amazon. And so, you know, a number of the stats that we came back with were really surprising to us. And again, this is aggregate over 100 brands. Again, I won't go into huge amounts of detail on the slides, so that we may have some time at the end for questions. But, you know, we're looking for things like, you know, did they include beneficial product titles, down to, you know, uniform information. And as you can see, there's a vast range in terms of scoring here, but the uniform information scored particularly low across the 100 brands at 24%, which is, again, quite surprising. And then this is the amount of sellers. So we talked a lot about how advanced the market is here, but on average, there was 2 to 5 sellers. 72% of the brands had 2 to 5 sellers in the top 3 listings. 24% average 6+ sellers in the top 3 listings. And 4% average 0 to 1 sellers on the top 3 listings. So again, there's some competition, but I don't think it's as prolific as what we would see in, you know, in a market more advanced on Amazon like the US. And then we looked at consistency of the brands around the content side. And so again, the blue line is all products, the black is some, and the gray is none. So you can see, you know, there's I guess what I would say is a high level of inconsistency, especially around the, you know, image badges and video that again, we thought was interesting to call out on this slide. So, you know, when you look at this, we just really think that in Europe, there's a much higher opportunity to win for brands that we work with, because we're taking best practice from the US market and what we've learned in a very competitive environment, and applying the localization and the thinking behind that winning formula that we've developed in the US, and applying it again to a less mature market. And we've seen some tremendous growth that we shared with you earlier. But again, I would push anyone to be looking at the same kind of things when they go over to Europe, to make sure that that's, you know, consistent with their US experience. Some of the other things around SEO. So this is, to me, this is what I would call, you know, like standard curation. The main stat that I'll call out here, and again, I'd encourage you guys to look at this and think about your brand when you're doing so. Only 9% of the 100 brands responded to poor reviews on their listings. This is a key area to win on. and it's super easy to do so. So just a bit of curation on your listings. Think about what kind of a negative customer experience that is for the consumer when they have a bad experience, and 91% didn't. So this is a massive miss. And so again, I think by doing these things right, it's just so much low-hanging fruit that you can get after.
Excellent. Man, there's a lot of stuff to go through here, Chris. You're going to have to, I know we're kind of coming up on time here. You're going to have to kind of direct me on what stuff you feel like is the most important to kind of cover before we wrap up. There are a handful of other questions here that might be helpful.
Sure. I would just say that the key takeaway on this is just localized products, making sure that the content is to a best practice standard in the local language. And I think the other points that we probably want to land here are mostly just around, a bit of that localization on the next slide. We might just show this one quickly because I think it's a relevant example that Charlie can talk through from one of the brands that we're working with now in Europe.
Yeah, cheers, Chris. Yeah, this just shows a really good example of kind of how we can take the same product in English on the left-hand side for the UK market and in German on the right-hand side, and really tailor the listing to the consumer in that market. Now, being one of the top sellers in Europe, we get kind of preferential access to some of the new features that Amazon are rolling out. And if you take a look at the imagery at the bottom, typically when you're uploading a listing in Europe, you would have to use the same image stack across the European instances of Amazon. However, we've got access to an advanced feature which now allows us to upload localized image stacks. So you can see in each of the images here, we've got a UK English and a German version of each of the images, which is really going to help with that localization on the page, trust in the product and the brand that's selling it, and also improve conversion going forward. So it's a really key element, and kind of having our position in the market with, and the clout that we kind of have with Amazon over here means that we can get access to these ahead of a lot of other sellers.
Excellent. So maybe I'll just pause on the next slide here so people can kind of understand what the kind of model is here, and I'll go to some of these questions here. So question came through, what do you see the success rate for US brands launching into the EU after year one? Companies see the opportunity for expansion but struggle with the P&L initially. So how do you set that expectation? Feel free, either you guys to take this.
Yeah, so I might jump in on this one. I mean, we do a lot of this in many different markets. I think we talked very similar about this in China. You got to have a realistic expectation. You got to set a goal and say, if we want to get to $1 million in sales, what I would do is I would segment it. Europe is a collection of countries, not one place. So I would look at, if you're an English speaking brand coming from the US, I would probably start in the UK. And then I would look to expand it to Germany once you get that market. If you've got a partner, even a skilled partner, it's about, bang for buck. So I would expect to spend 20 to 25% on driving awareness of your brand in the first year. So if you have $1 million target, I would expect to spend $250,000 in marketing dollars. And that's not necessarily just throwing money at a problem, but it should be there to drive the growth and the awareness of the brand. And then you can taper that off in year 2, year 3. But I think, again, setting up realistic targets, understanding who your competitive set are, and basically, hopefully getting a partner that you trust to help you with that, to do that is going to be really critical. I think where I've seen brands go wrong is they're not realistic about what they can do, what the price points are, and who the competitive set are. And then they just go in there expecting that it's going to be the same as their home market, when that's not necessarily the case. So I think a bit of advice and a bit of planning up front can save you a lot of money down the track. And, we've worked with a lot of brands, and some of the time the answer is, no, you shouldn't open in Europe because it's too competitive. And, there's entrenched local players that will cost you way more money than it makes sense to launch a brand in Europe. And so, we might advise them to start somewhere else, or, not to internationalize at that point.
Excellent. So there's another question that came through. Why so much focus on Amazon? Why not eBay? eBay is a bigger marketplace, so to speak, over there. And I think, from our perspective, we're struggling to even just get through enough slides just on Amazon. If there's enough interest on an eBay webinar, I'm happy to host one. Honestly, it's a great marketplace. Our experience has been, if you get Amazon right, it makes it a lot easier to then accelerate into eBay. If you do eBay right and you get Amazon wrong, there's a lot of damage that can happen. So, and we just wanted to address that there. One other question I don't actually know the answer to: how do you drive reviews without Vendor Central Vine? I know that Vine is a program that you can get exceptions. We've done it here in the US to be able to run it through Seller Central, but I don't know if you guys have any other additional question or feedback or insights on that front about driving without Vine reviews.
Yeah, so there's an early reviewer program that we can jump in on here, which is essentially the same thing as Vine. You get a bunch of products, we can get it seeded in from the brand, and we start the reviews like that. Again, you got to be careful with how you do reviews. So going through the authorized program is the only way to do it. And I would recommend that as a way to start. And in fact, we do that with a lot of brands. I don't know if you have any other comments, Charlie, around that, but that's, from my perspective, that's what I would, comment on.
Yeah, no, and I think the only point to add there is why we need, it kind of harks back to what Chris was talking about with the marketing spend and being realistic about kind of your KPIs. If you're a new brand launching a new ASIN into the market or a new SKU into the market, building up that review base is going to be key, and we can use marketing to help do that as well. If you've got no kind of organic listings or ranking because you're a new ASIN, we can dedicate part of the marketing budget into driving improved share of voice and discoverability, and help drive reviews through that by focusing on certain keywords and certain areas. So it's definitely part of the strategy we'd employ when we kind of think about launching a brand into the market.
Excellent. So maybe Chris, you can wrap us up. And if people have to drop, I totally understand. We're kind of at time, but I did want to just take a second to go through this case study and then walk through the competencies, and then we can wrap from there. So.
Yeah, so yeah, the case study that we have, and this is a very similar case study to a lot of brands that we take over from 1P to 3P. And remember that in the US, Amazon squeeze brands a lot more heavily around moving from 1P to 3P. So it's not impossible, but you have to have the right partner, and we've managed to do it in the US. But a lot of people have the perception that it's just not possible in Europe. There's no model that supports it, and 3P is a challenge over here. So it's the same kind of thing. They're losing control of their premium position while they were selling on Amazon 1P. They weren't stocking the full range, and the support was just terrible. I think they went through 4 vendor managers within the space of like 6 or 7 months. They wanted to come to us for more control over the model. We wanted to stock the full range because we felt that was the right offer. And they weren't really getting the same level of support on local content. So we really upped our game in terms of the content and pushed it out into most of the markets. We're not working with them in all markets across Europe at the moment, but we're about to take over the remaining one shortly. We increased the availability. We removed the discounting. That's an ongoing battle as it is in the US with arbitrage sellers or people dropping in on listings. We managed basically the end-to-end ecosystem with them, and we've started to get some really strong growth after a few months of cleaning up. So I think it's a really good story for us. And again, I think what I would say from, moving from a 1P to a 3P model is that, if you want control over the pricing, and if you want control over, I guess your destiny on Amazon, the 1P model is a challenge in Europe because Amazon do play, off the markets against each other.
Interesting. So maybe to just take us home here, Chris, we've kind of recognized e-commerce in Europe is absolutely complex. What are maybe some of the main takeaways for you? Let's go back to this slide here in terms of choosing a partner. We obviously are biased. We want to be that partner for any of the brands here, but talk us through if someone's going to do it on their own, or if they're going to choose a different partner, what do they need to be focused on?
Yeah, so I think you need to be focused on, the activities that we talked about and the activities that we looked at in the report. But, I think the key takeaways is make sure you understand the culture and the market that you're going into. Very difficult to run a business in Europe and drive an outcome in the US. And it's the same way when you're looking at the US and trying to drive an outcome in places like Italy. You've got the time zones, you've got the challenges around that. So when you're looking for a partner, or if you're going to establish a business in the region to help drive your outcome, just start thinking about the kind of things that drive excellence. So you have to have the right content, localized. You need to have, good local customer service. You need to interface with your consumers and understand what the local offering is, price points, and making sure that you understand who the competitive set is in the marketplace and how you're going to win against them. That's critical.
Excellent. Well, guys, thanks so much for joining us today. This is, like I said, it's hard to get through so much great content here, but for any of those attending, thank you so much for joining. We'll send out this recording. And if you have any questions about the Europe market or want to do a custom analysis on your brand, feel free to shoot us a note. You can email me, john@pattern.com, or go to the website and submit a consultation request. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.